when it comes to choosing plants for someone's landscape, including my own, I always go back to resources that I trust to remind me of the microclimates that those plants prefer, and it has influenced the fact that I have not yet planted a tree in my front yard. I'm really sorry about that, but can't decide because I know too much or don't know enough. So at some point in this presentation, I'll give some sources for us all to consider. And let's jump into microclimates, what they are, and why we should concern ourselves with them. So in order to understand a microclimate, we need to consider what is climate. What is our climate here in South Central Kentucky? We're all accustomed to the plant hardiness zones. South Central Kentucky, as of 2005, was considered to be in 6B or 7A. And as the climate warms, when the USDA agrees that that's happening, then perhaps they'll change their map. But that's this map here. And then in the last 20 or 30 years, the American Horticulture Society came up with not minimum temperatures, but the maximum temperatures. So South Central Kentucky is in the zone that receives 60 to 90 days of temperatures above 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And then in the center is average annual precipitation. All of these combined create what we think of as our climate in South Central Kentucky. Microclimate is a subset of a climate. It is a aggregate of differing atmospheric conditions from the general climate. And microclimates are defined by the influences of 5 general aspects: precipitation, the annual pattern and the type. Precipitation for our part of Kentucky could be rainfall for 3 days, very gentle, such as you get in November, or it could be the sudden showers that we get in the summer that last for 5 minutes, maybe hit your property but not your neighbors, and everything in between, up to 2 inches in one rainfall event sometimes. The soil type, to me, is more important for us to consider and think about because it's hidden, it's under our feet. We don't see the effects of soil type in our everyday living, but it is extremely important to the health of plants, as most gardeners learn, either through classes or experience. The solar aspect, does your garden face north, south, east, west, has a lot to do with how plants thrive. And then the amount of sunlight in hours and the time of day. Last in my list is wind disturbance or lack thereof. And this is one that most people do not think of readily. It's certainly not mentioned on plant tags. But the purposes of what we're talking about tonight is to influence you to do one of 3 things when you go to make your garden. It's up to you. You have your choice of choosing a plant that fits your site just as it exists. Janine has an acre, I think she said, of open meadow. No sun problems there. She has lots of sun. She could change that up if she wanted to. She could dig a pond, make a berm, and go crazy with that. A lot of us don't have that kind of possibility. We have trees, our neighbors have trees. We're hemmed in by buildings, garages, patios. We can change the site to mitigate those effects. We can experiment by just putting something down, or we could do some of all of those. So, how do you know which plant needs? You go to reputable sources, such as, for me, that's the Missouri Botanical Garden online. I check with them religiously every time I go to specify a plant to make sure that I'm not forgotten. For instance, that a hemlock tree does not like to be in a windy situation, whereas a cedar tree, another evergreen, is fine with being in the wind. That's an online source, but I think one of the most important sources is our friends who already grow the plants or have the microclimate. Richard was talking about preserving endangered plants, and I'm expecting that in order to do that, the members of his group are either creating microclimates suitable for the preservation and growth of the plants that they want to preserve, or they have chosen members who do have those microclimates already existing. When you go for your online information, it is important to look at the number of ads on that site. And I'm being a little funny here, but it's true. If you, for instance, do a Google search for Echinacea purpurea or purple coneflower, you'll get a zillion hits and opportunities to follow those links. As you click on the links, choose a link that is from a source like .edu, which is going to be a university horticulture department, or ORG is likely to be a plant group that is like Wild Ones, where you can get people who know to share their information with you. I like books, I have lots of them, and I occasionally read magazines. I think Fine Gardening is a great magazine full of good information, and one of the attributes of that is that they often have plant groups, plants that look good together and have the same microclimate requirements. So that's a go-to magazine for me. Then you could take classes from reputable teachers like Janine, or a Master Gardener's class. And lastly on this topic is the bit of advice relating to this hosta tag here in the center. Do not depend on those tags to tell you everything you need to know. This one, part shade to full shade, right. Every one of us has probably grown a hosta. No, it is not native, but it's a good example. That part shade to full shade is misleading, and a lot of plant tags are, because they will always say plant in well-drained, loamy soil, and very few of us have that. They don't mention adjacent plants that compete with the plant that you want to install. So don't depend on those guys. They just want to sell plants, bless their hearts. And then, so trust your sources. Soil is critical. And in this part of Kentucky, we have an abundance of the clay type of soil, which is represented in this chart right here, which is about the wetting patterns. So this page is about combining precipitation with soil. And I have not addressed something that is also extremely critical, which is the compaction of soil that occurs through people walking, cars, vehicles driving across your property, or if your house is relatively recently built, the construction equipment that was used during that building and how it has compacted the soil, squeezed out the air and all the pore space. Now, if I am over your head or you already know this, I apologize, but let me drop back to talk about sand versus clay. This diagram shows that water poured on a sandy soil, percolated through the soil in 24 hours, what took the same amount of water in a clay soil 48 hours to travel. It went in a vertical direction, whereas the clay soil expanded more in a horizontal fashion. And that is because sandy soil is similar to a ball in shape, not exactly, but for general discussion, let's just consider it to be a pile of sand is like one of those play zones at McDonald's where the kids jump in the balls and can scoot readily to the bottom of the pile, versus the clay soil, which is a soil composed of plates, P-L-A-T-E-S, like dinner plates or saucers that are stacked like a stack of plates in your cabinet. And they are tightly held. Water, just like children, could not easily dive under a stack of plates. If you can imagine that picture, a child trying to crawl under a playroom full of plates would take a lot longer to travel the same distance. And then the sun. This is the one that's on the plant tag for sure, and one that we're really accustomed to thinking about when we choose our plants. Use this same little diagram over and over throughout this talk because it's so important. And Barbara DeGraves was talking about earlier how her garage gathers the sun and reflects the heat. So when looking at this wall in this diagram, you see they're describing the exact same thing. The sun is coming in, reflecting to the plants in front of the wall, and that can be both good and bad, as Barbara said. So off to the right then are the descriptions, full sun, and then we flip into shade in varying degrees of relief from the sun, light shade, partial shade, full shade, dense shade. Light shade is hardly distinguishable from their description of full sun. 3 to 5 hours of direct sun in the summer, well, you can grow vegetables, a lot of vegetables in a vegetable garden with that kind of light shade. Along with this comes what we know as gardeners at the morning sun. Don't ask me why. It's out of my realm of knowledge. Is cooler and less intense. So that plant that likes light shade might do better on the east side of your house than the west. Or depending on what sort of plant it is, it might really prefer the heat from the west side. Along with this, I'm going to interject what happened to maple trees, red maple trees. Maple trees that are planted on the east side of a property are growing small, let's just say small trees going great. And they've been growing as newly planted plants all summer long. And then here it is wintertime, they lose their leaves and they're going dormant. And we get a hard freeze. And that's fine and dandy, but the following morning, oftentimes following a hard freeze, the sun is bright and relatively hot. When that sun hits the thin bark of the red maple tree, if the tree trunk is small enough and cold enough, it can split the trunk of a red maple just from the effect of the expanding cells underneath that bark. However, if the same tree or type of tree, same size, were planted on the west side of the house so that it didn't receive that morning sun, it wouldn't have that effect of splitting because the sun would have not hit the bark early in the morning when the tree was so cold. So simple things like that can make a big difference in whether or not your plants thrive or don't thrive. Partial shade, 2 hours of direct sun or shaded for at least half of the day. Often this is around trees or houses, outbuildings. And full shade is dappled light through a tree. This is what hostas like. This is what a lot of the woodland ferns prefer in terms of only the sun, right? So when you're deciding that you want to do woodland ferns, you need to consider the soil, the amount of shade, and the precipitation, and the amount of wind that might be coming to your site. Dense shade is what happens under magnolia, southern magnolia trees, evergreens, almost every evergreen, especially those that have branches to the ground. And often there is nothing but a stray piece of Bermuda grass that will grow in those conditions. Wind turbulence is, as I say, something we don't often think about, but in that space between neighboring houses, you often get the Venturi effect, the little diagram down here on the lower right, where the wind is concentrated. So although you may consider that you don't have a windy site, you can get the drying effects of the wind moving through that area continually. And the diagram right above it shows us a vertical wall, similar to this vertical wall, and how the wind moving over it, how do I say that? The wind moves over it and back down to the ground, but right behind the wall, you get this eddy effect. Same thing that we're seeing in this diagram here. This is where you get leaves deposited on the back side of a wall or a building, and you rake those away, or you sweep them off your patio, and the next day they're there, or your fence collects these leaves, and so it's creating a little microclimate that you could use or hate. You know, I suggest you use it and find a plant that enjoys that situation if you have a wall or a privacy fence. So you can match the plant you want to the microclimate you have. My choice is to create a microclimate for the plant community you want to grow. Or you could set her down and take your chances. I'll use as an example, and I did not include a picture, because I can never be satisfied that the picture is good enough, of a microclimate I created at my house. And I confess I don't use all native plants. This was a microclimate I created several years ago. Full sun, flat lawn, and wanted to grow herbs. As I pondered my possibilities, I decided to bring in humus and sand, incorporate it into my existing clay soil, and make a mound. Stuck a rock in it to give some continual interest. And on that mound, I planted roses and sage, oregano, thyme, and chives. And they all thrived wonderfully. It was my first experience with creating a microclimate. I was really tickled because they all lived, they coexisted for the longest, about 10 years until I took out the roses. So that is what I like to do, is create a microclimate. I've got to talk about my mom now. She was one of those people who would go to the plant store, Lowe's. She'd cruise through there and find some poor half-dead plant and bring it home and just put it out. And she has a she had a chaste tree that she called her 50-cent plant. She put it out by the privacy fence in partial sun. It was about 3 inches tall when she set it down, and the thing is 15 feet by 15 feet in perfect health and blooms like crazy every year. So as sure as I tell you, oh no, you need to create a microclimate or that plant will never do, you can be assured that it will. When you do what I like to do, which is create a microclimate, you have an opportunity to squeeze more into a small amount of space. Here's our same diagram that we've seen before. And here is an interpretation of that diagram. In this one, the sun is coming here to the wall. And this is the mirror image. So our sun, southern sun exposure, is coming here. I see one microclimate created by the full sun exposure that this slope of a created berm is going to get. Here we have the situation where this exists, where the top of the plant gets some sun, but right down in here is this situation. No sun, may not get much rainfall. Down in the bottom, likely to be collecting water. So flip over here to our rain garden. Here's the opportunity to have a rain garden in between these two berms. And then coming back up this slope, we have repetition of the southern sun exposure. Doesn't mean you have to put the same plants on this side as you had on that side, or you could mix and match. And then once again, you have the top of the slope, which is likely to be drier because of it's a hill, so water doesn't collect there like it does downslope, of course. And then this side, which similar to this, gets very little sun, possibly very little rain. I think the shape of these berms is exaggerated. I wouldn't build one that steep. But if you can get your soil to stack that tightly, or if you were to put a wall or a series of mechanical things to hold your soil in a steep position, like in a raised bed, that has room for pockets of plants to grow, that's a whole nother microclimate here, 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 3 on one berm. So while we're on the subject of rain gardens and the potential, I found these images. This is not a project that I designed. This is a project I would have liked to have designed because it is a rain garden that you would never know is a rain garden. Obviously bounded by these stones, water can get in between the stones. This is a yard inlet. I suspect this is a really wet area of this property, so they have hedged their bet by having the yard inlet as well as the rain garden. Underneath this gravel is probably engineered soil, like this soil compost mix here is most likely underneath this entire planting. So what we're seeing looks like just a nice collection of plants, but it functions like this rain garden that we're seeing here. And the lower picture is also not a project of mine, but it's a demonstration of how creating the hills and dales in the landscape turns a flat landscape into a more, to me, more interesting landform, and at the same time gives you the opportunities to use these different microclimates created by the landform to give you variety in what you plant. And in this case, there's several plants that are natives. Here's echinacea over here. This looks like liatris, but the daylilies are not necessarily native, and to Kentucky, the blue spruce is not, but they have incorporated both natives and non-natives to get what most people want from their planted landscape, which is interest year-round and maintenance that they can understand and that the neighbors like as well. Here's some examples, opposites of rain garden. Sedum growing on a roof. It's a drought-tolerant plant, but sedums also could grow in a rock garden or even basic lawn, flat lawn area. But they're very well adapted for this kind of arrangement. And then in this green roof, the owner has used native grasses, so they have a thicker substrate of soil in order to grow those, but they have drought-tolerant grasses on top of their shed. In this lower left picture, we have a waterfall and a rock garden mound. And here's our friend, purple coneflower, loving that. Lots of sun. This looks like a phlox, probably not a native. And here's the lawn going right up to it. So they created a great place for animals to get water, as well as pollinators to access the flowers and hopefully other host plants. So that brings me to the end of my prepared discussion, and I have some sources on the next page, which I'll share with you. This one's from the University of Kentucky, and a word about the Cooperative Extension Service. They will only publish material that they have done research on. And their interest in native plants is not all that great compared to crop plants. So there's not a lot of information about native plants from them compared to what they can provide But they do have a good basic article on residential rain gardens and how to design them and maintain them, build them and maintain them. This book is great if you're interested in planting trees or tree communities. Gary Heitschuh and Michael Durr are, well, they're just excellent authors. Right Plant, Right Place is actually a book that gives us the title for this talk, but is published originally for English, or gardens in Great Britain, I should say. And so there's a North American editor, but if you're reading or looking at this book, you'll notice mostly you're going to have to read between the lines to understand what will work in the United States. Last of all, but not least, is the Rooftop Growing Guide, which is one of my next projects. I have a shed. It has the most part of the roof is slanted towards the south. And so I'm pondering how to get a green roof going there. And I'm pretty sure that as soon as I get it going, the neighbor's trees will grow enough to shade it, and I'll have maybe a few years to enjoy it, and then I'll have to put a normal roof on it. So with that, I am finished here, and welcome discussion and lots of questions, please. Yeah, Richard.
Well, that was fascinating to see a point of view of a landscape architect. I'm kind of a grab a plant and stick it in the ground and see what happens kind of guy. But like your grandmother, sometimes I get lucky and things work out. So I've got a side yard that's north facing. It never sees any direct sun except on the summer solstice and the winter solstice. Well, not the winter one, but just this, he gets a few days of sun early in the morning and late in the afternoon, right around June 21st. So it's totally shaded. However, my neighbor on the other side of my side yard has a white siding house. And so it actually reflects quite a bit of light and a little bit of heat. And so I've found over the years that I can get away with a part shade plant over there that tends to be pretty happy. But I avoided that for a long time because I wanted just things that do okay in total shade, like a ground cover, like green and gold, or one of those Pachysandra ground covers. So I slowly discovered that I could actually put some part shade plants there, and it seems to be working pretty well. Does that make sense?
Yes, of course it makes sense. How much rainfall do you get on that garden area?
Here we get about 40 inches a year.
No, I mean on that particular piece of land that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's
it faces north. Do you get like a shadow?
There is a rain shadow because the prevailing winds come from the southwest, and so I would say it doesn't get a lot of direct sun, but I have the luxury, I can manipulate that with irrigation. So I've got a 12-zone irrigation system because it was already in the house when I bought it. So that's the one thing I can manipulate is water.
I was able to grow butternut squash on the north side of my house. Now my house is 1 story tall, and the front yard faces north, and had to take out all the roses. Those, what kind of roses are they? They had the virus, the knockouts.
Knockout, yeah.
So I took out all the knockout roses, which had done pretty well because as you're talking, they get some sun from the east and some from the west, being on the north side of the house. The butternut squash did fabulously because those leaves out in the sun evidently were feeding back to the area of the plant that was in the shadow of the house. It was very amazing. And I had planted them far enough away from the house that it didn't have the rain shadow effect at all.